Hello, everyone. We, the editors of the Stained Glass Window, are have our greatest pleasure to have Amir Hussain and Muniza Shamsi with us. And these are a series of sessions that we're holding to speak to the beating hearts of our compilation, our contributors. So this session is called Reading and Writing During the Pandemic, and this is the first of 8 episodes that we'll be running on Facebook through Liberty Books. And I'll let Sana Munir, my co-editor, introduce Muniza Shamsi, and I'll go on to introduce Amir Hussain.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much, Muniza and Amir, for being here. This is very exciting for me, and I'm sure for the listeners and viewers as well. I'll just go ahead and read a brief bio of Ms. Muniza Shamsi. Muniza Shamsi is author of a literary history hybrid type tapestries, The Development of Pakistani Literature in English, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. And she is an area editor for the Literary Encyclopedia. She is bibliographic representative of Pakistan for the Journal of Commonwealth Literature. She serves on the International Advisory Board of the Journal of Postcolonial Writing and has edited its special issues 52.2 and 47.2, Beyond Geography, Literature, Politics and Violence in Pakistan. She is also on the advisory committee of the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature and served on its 2013 jury. And we all know her. She's a legend. So, over to the other legend.
The other legend is Amir Hussain. Amir Hussain was born and brought up in Karachi. He studied for 2 years in South India before moving to London at the age of 15 in 1970. He has published various short story collections, including Mirror to the Sun, This Other Salt, Insomnia, The Swan's Wife, and the list goes on. Recently, he has published his first short story collection in Urdu called Zindagi Se Pehle. He's also known for his 2 novels, Another Gulmohar Tree, which was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and The Cloud Messenger. He's the Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of English Studies, University of London, and was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 2004. He lives in London and travels and works frequently in Pakistan too. So these are our legends. These are our one contributor and someone who was very kind enough to give us a commendation for this book. So I'd like to begin with Muniza Shamsi, and I think this is a very important question with regard to the book. So Muniza blurbed the book, and she was very kind, as I said, to give us a blurb. What was your first reaction when you got to read this book? Did you have any preconceived notions, any initial thoughts? Did your expectations, were they shattered? Were they met?
No, I didn't have any expectations as such. I was just kind of so impressed that people were writing about it. I've just been rattling around thinking, I'm living in this kind of locked world. And I'm just carrying on with my regular work. But to actually use it as creative expression, I thought that was something so wonderful, and to do it so immediately. And then to capture, there are different stories, so one can't go into sort of details, but so many of them capture the kind of doubts and then the differences between the generations, between children not going to school, all these kind of, and yet they're not as kind of lectures or anything. They're about genuine experiences that everybody goes through, or if you haven't gone through, your friends have gone through. Yeah. And some, of course, move beyond that into contemplating other issues too. But I thought they were really tremendous. They were good fun to read.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Indeed. Do you have a favorite, though, of all the stories?
Do I have a favorite? No, I don't think I want to comment on favorites. I think that's I kind of like them all. And
rightly so.
And I like all yours. All 3 of you. I love all of them.
Oh, that's the best compliment. Thank you so much. That's very kind.
They were so diverse, and they covered different subjects. That actually the stories of the 3 of you kind of embody the diversity, and yet the veracity of the stories. They're stories, but you kind of feel that they involve a part of you. rather than, something sort of out there. And I like that very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to ask this question to Amir, but I would love Muniza to please answer it later as well. This is more general, not really related to the book, but since we are going back into lockdowns again, I'd just like to ask both of you what kind of books you've been reading. Has there been a specific genre that you've been following, or have the lockdowns and then the semi-lockdowns, the smart lockdowns, and then the strict lockdowns? Has any of this affected the kind of genre that you have been into, or has it been open-ended, or whatever have you been reading? I'd love to know.
Yeah, you wanted me to answer first. Of course, our lockdowns have followed a very different shape from yours. So if I go back to the time that we had our first long lockdown and I wrote the story and sent it to you, at that time I was rereading work of Han Suyin for work, for a long essay I was writing. I was reading an Italian writer called Lala Kesic, because I also translated 2 of her short stories directly from Italian into Urdu. Wow. I reread Matthew Arnold because I remember the quotation, "Ye suffer from yourselves." So I found the book on Kindle because I couldn't go out to a library or bookshop and read the whole thing. Realized that I had read the life of the Buddha through that book as a child. I then reread Kalidas, a lot of Kalidas. This was probably July I'm talking about. More recently, because I'm in a lockdown right now, I've read about 10 books in the last week. Reread Ali Farafat's book stories, Egyptian. I read a few plays by Tawfiq al-Hakim. I read Kabir and Mira in Hindi because I'm looking at their nature poetry rather than the philosophy. And today I'm reading a translation of Shah Abdul Latif in Urdu by Sheikh Ayaz. And what else? Something in English as well. Alaskan folk tales, because but no genres. In a sense, yes, I'm drawn to either poetry or philosophical writing for various reasons, not just a lockdown. But I never had this kind of obsession about reading books to do with pandemics. So Albert Camus' The Plague was never a Bible of my lockdown days or anything like that. So I wasn't looking for science fiction or anything of the sort. Not at all.
All right, thank you. That's great. That's wonderful. Muniza, the same question to you, please.
What I've been doing, actually, I've just been working away, really. I got a row of books which I want to read, and there are books that I'm reading because I'm working, and they're part of my work. Most of them, obviously, are Pakistani English writing, because that's what my work is. But kind of interesting things. I was doing this bibliography, and if it's somebody special year, and I discovered it was the 150th year of Ghalib's. I think it was his birthday. Anyway, so and people kept quoting Ghalib, and I thought, well, why we quote? Because I didn't associate Ghalib with pandemics, and then I do a little research, and then I find that poor chap lived through 4 pandemics, including cholera and smallpox. And what's actually happening through reading is I'm kind of in a kind of time warp, and I think of other times. Yeah. And I realized, my God, he lived through 4 pandemics. I never realized his son Zainul Abidin had died because in one, and that somehow Zainul Abidin died was kind of different to Zainul Abidin died in a pandemic. That kind of brings it home to you. And of course, then having been to Old Delhi, I imagine those houses and Gali Qasim Jan and all that. So that was one aspect of it, of not reading but researching. The other book I actually did was a book it was called it was about the Indian contingent at Dunkirk. Now, we don't really know much about Indians at Dunkirk, but they were there. And I was one of the people with my friend Zinat Ziad, and her father, General Anis, had been at Dunkirk, and he had been captured. He'd been a prisoner of war for practically the whole war. And that fascinated me because, of course, I had my mom was also a prisoner of war. He was captured at Tobruk, in Egypt. He spent 3 years. And that again made me think this whole thing of an enclosed world, or what it must be like to be a prisoner of war, not being able to get out. What did they feel? And suddenly this whole pandemic has actually made me think very differently about writing. I read Muniza Naqvi, A Guest in the House, her Saving Pania book house, from being sold. And she's done so much work in it. And I think, how will the pandemic affect this book, how she's put so much work into it. I hope the bookstores like this carry on. So that's what my reading has done for me in a very kind of personal way.
Well, that's great. Great.
That's great. So
Thank you
this
very
is
much.
more specifically for Aamir. Your story, The Garden Spy, it has a very unique title, something that intrigues all of us. What can you tell us about the title? How did you chance upon it? What happened?
It's right there in the story. It's
Spy on
my
Gardens.
friend in Rome. My friend in Rome, whom I've known since she was 15 and I was 23, I believe, who just said to me, "I love your photographs. I hope you wear a mask when you go out." So I said, "Well, yes, I do. I wear a mask and I take photographs of other people's gardens." So here was this masked guy going around taking
And that's
pictures
in the
of the
story.
neighborhood. Yeah, that's in the story, just as it was. I have reported the emails exactly as they were the day that we sent them
So
to each other. And
that's
she
what
said,
I
"You better
wanted to
make this a
ask you
story." And I
about.
said, "Okay, I will." So that's why I'm a garden spy.
that's
The mask
exactly
and the
what I wanted to
peering over
ask
people's
you.
walls.
At a time like this, when you're asked to write a story about the pandemic, you're drawing upon reality and yet you're fictionalizing it. How much of what you wrote in The Garden Spy is fiction and how much of it is reality? Are there strands of both? Or are you compressing reality into a 3,000 word story or something like that?
Compressing. The first part, I think, is exactly as things were. Then the second part, I couldn't remember the sequence of events because I stopped keeping a diary during lockdown. So what happened in July seems to have happened in June. What happened in June seems to have happened in July. And when I sat down to write the second part, then I was terribly overdue with the story. I just had to compress stuff. So a lot of things that I put in, was planning to put in, didn't go in there. And I fast forwarded, and perhaps the last sequence happened quite a bit later than I had it happen in the story. I wanted to end it by June when the narrator, writes the long essay on his mentor, Elizabeth, which was the real name of Hans Rien, by the way, when I was writing.
Talk a little bit about your story. What is it about? How would you, if you were to summarize it very quickly, it's a terrible thing to ask a writer to do, but maybe just for everyone's benefit, anyone who hasn't read it, what can you tell us about The Garden Spy? Or if
so that people are more, they look forward to read it more.
Well, I suppose it's a story about how friendships survive during difficult times, how relationships are defined and redefined, because, whether or not the narrator is willing to go out and face the world in whatever form or with whichever armor he has at his disposal, getting to meet people is very hard. And one or two people said, "Well, is there any difference between the story and the ones you've written before?" Yeah, if you take my old story, Insomnia, to which this is a kind of twin written 15 years ago, I happened to think about that. That the narrator's mind moves to Indonesia, it moves to Dorset, it moves to Italy, it moves to London, and he's walking up and down London and meeting friends with great freedom. Here, every movement is circumscribed. If it's a bus journey, it's circumscribed. If it's a walk, it's circumscribed. He hasn't seen his best friend in 9 months. So the entire context is that of the pandemic. You can't escape it at all. It's not intentional. It's not because I was told to write a story about this period, but because I do tend to write very much about the present day. As you know, my new fiction has very little to do with nostalgia, unless it's got the loss of someone who died, which does come into the story. That's also directly connected, because we don't know whether a friend who's died has perhaps died of COVID-19. And there are also people with COVID-19 in the very first paragraph of the story when he goes to visit the church and accidentally sees that poster, which is all true. I can even show you the. And, for those people who are ill, luckily both of them survived. So yes, I suppose a story of hope during hopeless times.
Well, it's a lovely story.
It is, yes. It's a beautiful story. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to carry on the conversation where it stopped with Munisa, since it was not my turn to ask another question, so I had to wait. You just mentioned the kind of books that you've been reading. and how they have affected you or how they have changed your reading habit. That's something that I really want you to draw upon. That's something that I really want to ask. And I would love if you could elaborate a little. How does the environment around us, whatever kind of environment, for example, if this is, since this is a book about the pandemic or the lockdowns, even generally speaking, even if there's war outside or there's, any other calamity, how does that affect a reader? Because from what I have observed, very humbly, is that some people intend to read, for example, if there's gloom, they'd like to read stories of gloom, maybe just to address their own gloom, their own sadness. And the other kind is if there is gloom outside, or if there is some kind of calamity, they are going to escape. They're going to look into other kinds of books. I think that's something that Aamer also hinted at. They'll go and read poetry or something that just takes them away from. So, I just want to hear what you have to say about this. How does the environment around us affect the reader or the writer in us? And does it? Or should it?
No, I don't actually see myself as someone who reads books, whether it's gloomy or whether thing. I mean, I just I'm not sure what makes me think, oh, today I think I'll read this, or yeah. I mean, I don't actually ever react and say, oh, this is such a gloomy book or this is such a bright book. I don't know. I've never actually given this much thought. I just read. If it's nice, if it's good. I just enjoy it. I usually do finish books, even if they're boring. I keep thinking it's so boring.
That's my next question.
But I tend to finish them.
Great.
So reading in pandemic is not anything that kind of affects me. What I read, I mean, they're just books I want to read, and I will read them. If I hear about them, if I think they sound exciting. Although, frankly, my life seems to be full of books I want to read, and I haven't quite had time to read. Yeah. I just love reading. I've loved reading since I was a child. It's never had anything to do with mood, I don't think.
Yeah.
But I might be wrong.
No. I completely agree, actually. I'm so glad you said this. Aamer, same goes to you. Do you have anything to add? I'd love if you'd add something.
Yes, I do. In fact, I mean, I would have echoed Muniza, but I realized that one of the reasons that I've been looking at all this stuff in Mira and Kabir is that, of course, you do begin to examine your relationship with nature, your surroundings, with the animal world, with the human world, etc., at these times. And I was reading Kabir, I think, 3 days ago, and I love him. I, listened to Kabir as a child when I couldn't read Hindi because my mother was a wonderful singer, and what she used to sing was a lot of Kabir. And it's very bleak, Nahi jana desh virana, nahi rehna yahan desh virana hai, etc. Or ye sansar kaante ki bari. It's that the world is a thorn bush. So I moved to Mira, and Mira is very celebratory. And she's always talking about Dadar Mor Papiha, the peacock and the frog and the cuckoo singing, and the rain's coming beautifully down on us. And then from there to Shahjo Rithala, which is again even more full of beauty and the beauties of nature, and also recognizes how adverse nature can be, because he has sailors going out and fighting the sea in Karachi. So again, we come back to my sea in Karachi, which is another thing that always recurs in my mind or in my imagination. I guess these things are all interconnected. Would I have been reading them in quite that much depth had I been going out to the library or going out to the bookshops and selecting new stuff? So those returns have to do with rereading those texts in with a fresh perspective.
Brilliant, thank you.
So I'm going to go back to Aamer because I was reading your story and I have many, many, many questions about it specifically. And so you've dealt with friendship and loss in this story primarily, whether it's personal loss or, just generally the way the world is moving. And this has been a recurring theme in your work, especially with regards to friendship. You spoke about insomnia earlier. Many of your stories do deal with friendship. Your main character, Mehran, has a lot of friends around him, even though he isn't physically meeting them. He has a companionship in the form of someone texting him. But do you think that he seeks solace in those friendships? Do they burden him? Because he seems to have a very almost ambivalent approach towards his friends at that point in time. He's frustrated with one friend.
I don't know if he has an ambivalent approach to his friends. His friends, I mean, Sophia and Mimi and one or two others are very important to him. And the friend who dies, who's his companion and the same age as him, means a lot to him. But he's beleaguered by questions, by requests for advice at weird times, like when he's going to a hospital. Now that again, the question about whether the pandemic affects it, yes, because if I go out in the pandemic to a hospital, I have to be very careful of what mode of transport I take. I have to wear a mask. I have to sit in a crowded room, all of which is in that.
Exactly.
Those things would matter much less were it not for the pandemic. And there's, of course, more stress on you when you're having to answer questions like this and trying to take a trip to the hospital and try to organize everything. So, yes, it's kaise log hamare dil ko jalane, ji ko jalane aa jate hain. Apne kham ke fasane hame sunane aa jate hain. So there is that quality too. I think that answers your question.
And then there's that friend of his who keeps saying kuch nahi hoga, sab theek ho jayega, and he's clearly dealing with...
The advice I want to give all Pakistanis, particularly at the end of the year, is please don't say it, because you're only seeking solace for yourself. Telling somebody kuch nahi hoga or sab theek ho jayega is just solace for yourself. It's escapism.
So that adds to Iran's frustration.
Absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's magical thinking. It exists in some form in all cultures. Like, your English friends who tell you, well, it's all good then, and you're just trying discreetly to tell them about something that isn't wonderful, The high has vanished. To continue, I mean, since those words that he quoted were in Urdu and they're in Urdu in the story, I'm giving this message to Pakistanis, but it's my universal message. Everything will be all right. Nope. Do the best and make the best of what you can, and lead each day as if it was going to be a day full of wonder, and try to find the solace at the moment.
Great, brilliant. Taha, do you have a question for Muniza?
So I'm very curious about the way writing about Corona will emerge from Pakistan. And since you are technically the authority on Pakistani fiction or Pakistani literature as a whole, I'm curious to know what trends you see emerging from Pakistan in terms of writing on Corona.
Well, there have been some collections coming out. I know, for example, that the Pakistani American poet Waqas Khwaja has written a very beautiful poem on the pandemic, and it's come out in an anthology. There's been some rather interesting creative writing. A couple of writers, they've contributed to. One of them I know is Humaira Afridi. They've contributed to online journals about Corona, their daily experiences. So, and then, I meet people who say, oh, well, my aunt is using this time usefully. She's writing a cookery book, or so-and-so's writing something else, writing her autobiography. And so I think there's going to be, maybe from unexpected quarters, people who maybe didn't have time. But I definitely see that it is going to be interwoven into our literary output. In what way, I have no idea. One of the things I loved about Sana's story was it was set in a hospital, as if, I don't know if you have experience of a hospital in that way, but it seemed terribly knowledgeable. Yeah. And the fact that the book was dedicated to a doctor, and I wonder whether we will get more medical thrillers coming out because of this. People in hospitals, people who've been in hospital, whether this will emerge. So far, there's not been very much. But I wonder if it will be a new direction. other than that, of course, various other people are busy finishing their books. I know one writer who has finished her book and who has another job and would possibly not have been able to do it. So we shall have to wait and see actually how it affects literary output.
All right, great. Muniza, I'd love to again retrace my steps to where we were having the conversation about your work, and you mentioned that you love reading, and I mean it's obvious, of course. I can see the books you post, and all the things that you post on social media. And it's very encouraging to see that not only English but also Urdu. What I wanted to ask is that how do you, since you write that research piece every year, I think for the Commonwealth Journal or something, so you have to read and go through every book that comes out in Pakistan, and you trace them, you look for them, and then you read. How's that? How does that happen? Can you just take us through the process? I'd really love to know how you do that, because that involves immense dedication, and it's very inspirational.
I don't know. I read every book. I read every book that I think is, what that I have to comment on. That I find, sometimes you read them and you find them. So, well, I do this throughout the year. You see, the way it works is, for example, the 2019 listing has just come out. So now, so throughout the year, and I'm now going to be putting together the 2020. So this gives you about 6 months after the year ends to collect material. So throughout the year, I read up. On what's coming out, what's not coming out. I record the bibliography, the listing throughout the year. But the actual reading, I then sort of, sometimes books come my way. Sometimes I read about them and think I have to get hold of this one. And so that's how it works. And then I kind of weld it in with all my other. Actually, one of the things I have to say, because I like reading, is in a way it's an inefficient way of working. I like to read the book just as a book. Okay, then I look at it from the point of view of a reviewer. So my first thing is always reading it, but it's very inefficient. It takes up too much time, but that's how it is.
Lovely.
Basically, I juggle my other work in with my reading. And,
okay, brilliant. And that also means that you keep journaling as you read them. Does that mean that, or do you work from memory later on?
No, I didn't go from memory. I just read them. If I think they're worthwhile, then I sort of have a look, and then I put notes on them.
Yeah,
I do notes on them. As I read them, I put notes on them. And then later on in the year, I put the notes together. The notes are usually much longer, and I have to condense them. And sometimes I run out of space because I have to have it only in so many words, and then I can't put in all that I want to say about a book, and that's very frustrating, but I manage somehow,
All right, thank you. Brilliant. Muniza, there's this one question that I've been swallowing ever since we have begun this conversation, and that is, what makes you put a book back unfinished? Since you said that you usually finish them, but what does make you put it?
Unfinished. I can't think of books I've put back unfinished. Unless I'm so bored that I can't think of one that I put back that's unfinished. Unless I'm so bored that I just forget to pick it up again, which I suppose must happen every now and then. And sometimes, when you have to read them out of duty, that I can tell you about more positively, and they're boring. And you sort of think, oh, do I have to go through this? So that is the experience of a boring book that I remember with greater clarity than an unfinished book that but it seldom happens. But
thank you.
So my question is to Aamir. Yeah, you're saying something, Sana?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Aamir if you wanted to add something to this, if you wanted to.
What boring books?
Why do I put books back on the shelf? Why do I put books back on a shelf?
Yeah.
I have no intention about leaving books unfinished. I find most novels incredibly boring, especially now.
Yeah.
Sometimes I want to reread things, but I get halfway through a novel and I think I've read what I want to read, and that's it. And unfortunately, they stay in a pile if they're new, but they go to their shelves very quickly if I think. I do. I admire the form, but personally, I engage much less with novels than with almost any other form of writing. And over the
All
years,
right.
it's become more so.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Taha.
You're
So
not
I'm glad you
included. I love your
mentioned
novels,
the
so don't begin to count yourself down.
Okay. So I'm glad you mentioned the novel because when I was reading The Garden Spy, maybe it was just the name of the character Mehran, it made me think of your novel, The Cloud Messenger. And I was just wondering because The Cloud Messenger does move from a first person account to a third person account. There is a narrative technique that it keeps shifting from what I recall. This story, on the other hand, is purely told in a third person perspective. Why? Was there a particular reason?
That's because it followed on from another story I wrote in Urdu, Zindagi Se Pehle, which you know, which I then reworked in English. And I like the third person because it gives that distance and that ability to fictionalize, to change the names of people, etc., etc. And me the freedom to walk in and out of the character's shoes if I want to. And it was just a very natural decision. Just a very natural decision, a decision that I'm very happy to have taken.
So do you believe
it comes naturally
that
to writing in the third person. Writing in the first person is an effort unless it's specifically a personal experience I'm writing about.
So do you believe distance was required to write this kind of a story on the pandemic? Do you feel
not specifically on the pandemic. Not specifically on the pandemic. I just wanted distance from that character, as I said, to allow him to move in a certain way and to rearrange events the way they happen organically in the story, not in my life. So it means that the fictional I, doesn't have to be myself. The fictional I arc doesn't have to be myself. It's my surrogate, my alter ego, who at times resembles me more and at times less. So in fact, as I think I've indicated, there's less invention in this story than there is in Zindagi Se Pehle, What Is Saved. More compression.
So we're getting a lot of comments. We're apparently a pleasant gathering, according to Rabia Saad.
There was a comment earlier as well. All right, we have a question.
Comment. Yeah.
We have a question.
Yeah. Want to read that, Sana?
All right.
Or should I?
Lalaine Fatma Rizvi is asking, do you think fiction around the pandemic will become the norm, or is this trend timely? I'd really like both of you to answer this. Punita, could you go first, please? Do you think fiction around the pandemic will become the norm, or is this trend timely? Please go ahead.
Well, that's difficult. I think that there will be a lot of fiction revolving around it that will appear in the next few years, I'm sure. And then I think in future times you will get a retrospect on it, you know. I was actually very fascinated to discover that Emma Donoghue had written a novel about the 1918 pandemic. And in fact, she'd been writing it before this one broke out. So it turned out to be very topical. But there's been, there's a way of looking back at things in which would probably throw it into a different perspective. But I think right now there will be quite a lot, because there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of material. There's a lot of unusual things. There are a lot of reactions. There are a lot of ideas, things that people hadn't thought of. Even thinking about the past, it may make people think about the past in a different way. So I think, yes, I don't think it'll be temporary. I think there'll be quite a lot coming out of it. I don't know what Aamer feels.
I think if we reflect the circumstances of yes, I think that if we are looking at the circumstances of our life, yes, it will occur, because poets and short story writers particularly write a lot out of the context in which they live. So in my case, unless I turn back to the past and try to reclaim a moment of the past before all this began to happen to us. At the moment, I'm quite happy to continue. Happy is not the best word, but I will continue to write about the world as it surrounds us and the changes that we have to deal with every day. That's what I do, because I work in 3 genres. I write personal essays. I'm more and more compelled to write memoir because of requests from people to memorialize people I knew who were dead or have gone. And my fiction tends to come out of my day-to-day circumstances. But I also write fables about animals, and I write fables about birds and about human beings and their relationship with each other. So that might take me right away from the pandemic. What I read, I'm not looking to see what the writer's particularly addressing other than the subject of their fiction or non-fiction. But I won't go rushing out to read pandemic non-fiction books, not at all.
Okay, so
All right.
2 questions.
Yes, please, Taha.
I think there was one before Sheroz. I think that's Kariba. It's an interesting question, so I thought I'd bring it up. How can we differentiate between fiction and non-fiction in terms of literature? And how can fiction be understood without reality and vice versa? Why I thought this was interesting is because this specific book it draws upon fiction. So what do you guys have to say about this? Amir, Munizah.
I'd love to hear what Munizah has to say about it first, and then I'll come in.
Yes, please. I think this is the fact versus fiction thing, especially relevant to this book. That's what the question is pointing at. So would you like to just comment generally? You don't really have to specify this book. Generally, fact versus fiction. Could you just comment?
How do we differentiate? Well, I'm not sure that I mean, a work is called a work of fiction. Okay, you don't often know enough about the writer's writer. Sometimes you read, and I'm not sure why you need to make such a clear dividing line. A book is not about, to me, a good book is not about polemics. It's about characters, it's about structures, it's about style.
Exactly.
If you write a story which is about yourself, okay, but if it doesn't have structure and style and all that, it's useless.
Yes.
Exactly.
So actually, there is this whole thing that even when people write memoirs, how much of it truth? How much have they left out? Who have they sacrificed and who have they not sacrificed? How do you know? So it's not really something that you can differentiate with such difficulty. Excuse me, you have to go to Amir. My battery's running out. I'm going to change computers. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I'm very happy to take. I'm very happy to take on from that point. Let's just for a minute limit.
Okay. Sorry.
Let's just for a minute limit ourselves to autobiography and memoir, which already have a difference. A memoir can be of one particular circumstance, or one particular person, or one particular event in one's life. And of course, elision and compression is the main part of it. So it can sound like a story. It told as a story. Story does not necessarily mean fiction. Neither in story comes from the Italian word storia, which means a story, and it's the same word for history, which has nothing to do with his or her, by the way. It's historia means story. So,
I'm glad you said that.
Likewise, in Urdu, you say, "Main apni kahani sunata hu." "Main apni kahani sunati hu." That's a story. So when it's a memoir, that's what it is. An autobiography tends to have this feeling of lugubriousness, of tediousness, of accumulating details, of trying to recreate a time, a context, and becomes very much like social history. I mean, I think traditionally an autobiography normally means a work of social history in which the person often places themselves in the forefront as a witness to their times, to the changes in their times. Of course, novels have that aspect, but take a novel and take an autobiography, and you see that the novel will be based more on moments of being, on epiphanies, on this zaman-e-batin, which is interior time, and autobiography will be more about the happenings in the outside world. And those rare autobiographies manage to triumph and cross that boundary will perhaps reach us for their aesthetic as well as their sociological content, like Ada Jafri's Jurehi Zindgiri. But I've also noticed that books like that, as the narrator grows older, become more and more tied to the time, tied to the people they knew, tied to the social events they were part of, and then also become a laundry list of achievements. which the novel doesn't really accept or countenance, This list of, that I was there and I got this award, and that year when I was traveling in such and such a place and this happened, and then I met 3 famous birds from Peru and I got a letter from them. That's Amrita Pritam, various great writers who've written their autobiography. And you think, oh, I'd really much rather be reading their fiction. Always very interesting about childhood and early youth and first love and motherhood or fatherhood. And then this cavalcade of names,
Brilliant. Thank you. Amir, since we have you to us, okay, we're going to read this question. No, is this it? No. Amir, I have before we read this question. That is, what have you been writing through the lockdowns of the pandemic? I'd really love to know.
Through the lockdown, I think I mentioned the long essay on Hans Guyen. I did 2 short translations from Italian into Urdu. I write my Dawn columns. I translated 2 very short stories from a young Pakistani writer, Urdu writer. Very short, so they came out as prose poems in English. In one case, I didn't complete it, and when I read it to my group of writing friends, they said, but that's an entire story, and he's already published in Urdu, so that caused a bit of a problem, but I think he's going to reflect it. And the day before yesterday, I wrote something that's it's like a prose poem, and I'm intending to write the sequel to The Garden Spy, the stuff that I left out. But life has been catching up with me. 2 of my family got married in August, and so on and so forth. So I just don't know how much to put in and how much to leave out, and whether to do it. I had this discussion with my niece. About what we fictionalize and what we turn into, what we present as memoir. So, and finishing a book. Let's put it that way.
Oh, wow, that's cool to listen to. Amir, there's this thing that's been in my head ever since I read your story when you sent it in kindly, and that is, did you start off writing the story the way it is in 2 parts? Did you plan to write it like that, or is that just is this something that just came to you while you were writing it? Because
it came to me while I was writing.
Of time. That's something that's very interesting and intriguing about it. There are different sequences of time, as you've already mentioned to one of your answers to Taha, that you were picking memories or whatever experiences and observations, and you were putting them together in the story. So how did it go? Sorry for the long question.
Well, it was organic, but I reached a point where I felt there's a break, when he tells his friend that he's going to be writing a story called The Garden Spy. And then when I went back to it, there was just this question of making it a 2-part story and moving on and trying to do something else in the next part, which of course, they're interrelated. They're twins. They're almost identical, if not fraternal twins.
Yeah.
But it was quite a spontaneous decision. And I think all of you decided that, yes, it did work as 2 parts. If you had said, no, why do you want to make it 2 parts? I would have said, fine, run it as 1 full story. So.
Oh no, it was great the way it was.
Story.
Yeah. All right, Munisa is back. That's great. Can we have the question, please?
Yeah.
Munisa. All right, okay, go ahead, please.
It's for the both of you. There are 26 stories from different writers. Which one is your favorite and why? I think Munisa would be able to comment on this. I don't know if Amir has skimmed through the book.
Well, actually, I kind of opted out of this one because
earlier.
It's kind of hard when people are your friends and colleagues, so I'm not going to comment, but there's some very good stories. I'll tell you what really excited me about this, other than the subject and the whole idea. There were a lot of new writers, a lot of people that I didn't know who wrote short stories. And there's some really good short stories by a lot of new writers. And I think that's terrific. It's a great book. It captures so many experiences and it says so much about our world and about possibilities. So I'm not going to comment on my favorite. I'm going to opt out.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, cool.
All right.
So do we have another question?
Let me just check on. this as well. If there is anything else, because I'm simultaneously checking for questions here.
Amir, you just mentioned writing a prose poem. So do you frequently write poetry? Is that a first time thing?
Oh,
Would you like to read that out,
I'm not a poet at all. No.
You don't?
I'm not a poet at all, but I mean, I've just shown this to my poet friends, 2 of them, and they liked it very much. So hopefully it'll find its final form soon. But it's at the moment it's raw. It needs a final polish before I can unleash it on the world. It's a swan poem. It's a prose poem. It's not a poem. I can't write verse. I'm no good with verse at all.
So we have a comment here from someone who says that Sara D. Fawad wrote an amazing light-hearted book during this pandemic. I think this is just something to be looking out for. And apart from that, would Amir like to read something or anything you want to read from your book, from your story, The Garden Spy?
Sure, I can find it on my phone. But let me just give talking about light-hearted books. This is not light-hearted, but I think many of you will have heard of Sasha Akhter, who's a poet and a journalist and a reviewer and a critic, and she's produced her first collection of long and short stories about Karachi, entirely about Karachi.
That's lovely.
So talking about what one is reading, this is what's sitting on my table to read next. It's called Of Necessity and Wanting.
I'm going to write that down, yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. I should look out for that one.
Yeah, it's just published
That's how
in
I got
Britain.
information, you see.
She's done it as Sasha Akhter. The publisher is the 87 Press in Sutton, Surrey. And I read them all in manuscript and loved them. So I've been encouraging her to publish them for many years. Mohammad Hanif is also a fan of the book. And finally, she found a British publisher for stories that are not only set in Karachi, but have tranches of Urdu dialogue in them. And they're also set in the middle class and lower middle class milieus of Karachi. One of them does wander into a big house. But actually, she's talking about people who, about hairdressers and, people in not very high income brackets, which is very interesting. And there's a timelessness about it. I mean, talking about escaping from the pandemic, I'm quite looking forward to reading this because there won't be anything about, about COVID-19 in it. So.
All right. We had one. I think we had the last question here. It was that's usually, I'm saying it's the last because usually this is how things are usually wrapped up during these talks. And that is any advice for aspiring writers. And one who's asked the question is Huma Sheikh. So I'll start with Muniza Shamsi. Could you please reply? Any advice for aspiring writers?
Yeah.
Well, I don't really. My actually advice is just to read. You can you'd only become a good writer if you read good books. And so you read, and then you just start writing and have the courage to do it. And if you are writing away and you think it doesn't work, then you ask yourself, why is it that what I'm doing doesn't work, and why does X's book work? Then you look at X's book and you try and figure out what it was. But basically, to write, you really have to read. And that's really the only advice I can give you. I don't know.
I'll go on from there, having taught creative writing for my sins for 10 years at university in the early part of this decade, of this millennium. That's what I used to say, and I used to teach creative reading and not creative writing, really. I mean, I taught them how to read in such a way that would nurture their talents and so on. Now I say experience is the main thing. Of course, you find forms in different ways. These days, so many of us have writing groups. We belong even online to groups. So less and less is it reading, and more it's instruction or some kind of group workshopping makes the writer that you are, and people seem to depend on it almost relentlessly which I don't advocate. People should do what they want to.
Mhm.
But I think that experience, drawing from what life has given you, is probably the most important thing you can get. And that does not mean a confessional, because people make this incredible mistake and think that when you say draw from experience, saying, pour your heart and soul out. No. There are stories in every corner. There are stories that you heard and that haven't been told. There are stories that you are longing to turn into fiction. There are stories in the air. There are stories that are oral and not written. I think all that becomes ballast for your mill. And very often you write to right wrongs, even literary wrongs. You just pick up a book and you read that it's badly written or conveys the truth, incompletely, and you want to tell the truth in your own way, even if it's aslant. So I think these are all the bits of advice I would give. But experience is invaluable, and that's why I think that, very often people who start late in life jump into the arena with more panache than some young writers do.
So, are you ready with your reading, Amir, or?
Oh, do you still want me to do reading? Yeah, well, let's see if I can find a bit of the
You can do a very
Garden
quick one, and then we can just wrap up. Yeah.
If I don't find it really quickly, I'll just kind of...
Oh, that's fine. Taha, can you sing in the meanwhile?
Sing in the meanwhile.
While Amir is looking for the story.
Well,
So yeah,
Come on, Taha.
I don't sing, sadly, but
Oh, you do. Someone knows that you sing.
I do not. But okay.
Okay, found
I
my
guess I
story.
could just use this
Name
opportunity
by the
to.
phone.
Oh, he already found the
shamelessly
story, Taha.
promote
Miss.
the-
Yes. I'm just going to read the beginning. I think that'll be, literally a gateway. So, and make a sign to me when I've read enough. The roses were running riot in June. Evenings fell late. The long hours of light made him restless. He waited for the comforting shadows of night. That evening, he stepped out before sunset to buy something he didn't need, walked past the delicatessen where he usually got his cigarettes, and stopped at the church where red roses were blooming among yellow and white flowers in a little walled and elevated garden. A poster in the middle of the flowers announced, "Coronavirus affects us all. We are a church that prays. Can we pray for you, your situation, your family, and friends at this time?" He stopped to think about people he knew of who were affected by the virus, his childhood playmate son in Karachi and a dear friend of his youth in Islamabad, but he'd forgotten how to pray. He took his phone out of his pocket to photograph the poster and the flowers. Just then a gingery freckled man in shorts came out of a side door and removed the poster with both arms in one quick gesture without noticing Mehran, who said, "Do you mind if I take a photograph of that before you take it away?" "Oh, sure," said the gingery man, replacing the poster and moving away from the camera's eye. "I thought you wanted to photograph the flowers." "I often come here to do that," Mehran said, "or I just look at the flowers. See that tree?" The gingery man pointed upward. "In March it produces masses of yellow flowers, but I can't remember what they're called." They paused. They both said in one breath, "Mimosa." But he couldn't remember the mimosa flowering in March, neither this year when the lockdown was starting, nor last year when he was convalescing and homebound. He remembered instead filming the mimosa tree in a windstorm 3 years ago when the world seemed safer. And he remembered another film, another tree, rather a bush, flowering exactly a year ago. He'd seen the roses with his sister and photographed her beside them on one of their first walks after his illness, not knowing that she wouldn't live to see another season. She died before the year ended of a cancer that took her away in 3 months. She was born at the end of March and he in the second week of April. For a few days every year, they'd been twins.
It's a beautiful
Wonderful. Thank
beginning.
you.
And it's a glimpse of a story that appears in the stained
That's
glass
a lovely
window.
story, yes.
So if there aren't any other questions, I suppose we should wrap up.
Yeah, time's up as well.
Do you guys have any concluding comments to make? Anything you'd like to say before we end?
Looking
Not
forward to the
really.
book.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I mean, but for one thing, it's been great
Congratulations to both.
conversation, and the book is terrific. And the cover, I've never mentioned the cover. I love the cover. I love the symbolism of the stained glass, the different colors and the light streaming through. It reminded me of old houses, actually, that I lived in. But judge not a book by its cover, but the cover is beautiful, and the book itself is beautiful. It's got lovely stories in it, so everybody
Thank you
should
so
read it.
much.
Wonderful, wonderful.
By both our
so
questioners, between Zana and Tahir, great stories.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
both.
Means
Yes,
so
thank you
much.
both for having
Coming
us.
from both of
Great to
you.
see you virtually. Hope
Yeah,
we'll
you
all
too. Thank
meet
you very
again
much
face
for
to
being
face
here.
soon.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And everyone.
All right then.